I was facing 22 years in prison for a crime I never committed. Then, my daughter burst through the courtroom doors with the one thing that changed everything. The federal courthouse near Foley Square was cold that Tuesday morning, and reporters lined the marble steps with their coffee going flat in the wind, waiting on a verdict everybody already thought they knew. Arthur Vance sat at the defense table in a suit that hung off him now. He'd lost 15 pounds over 6 weeks he never expected to spend fighting for his life. 44 years old, he ran a small security installation business out of a rented office in Queens. Him and 2 guys he'd hired off referrals, a client list built one phone call at a time over 12 years. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was a login credential, a timestamp, and a server breach that had drained proprietary data out of Apex Dynamics, a data infrastructure firm 2 blocks from the courthouse that had spent years building a reputation as the cleanest name in the industry. The kind of company that sponsored cybersecurity panels and sent executives to testify in front of Congress about protecting consumer data. That reputation was exactly why the jury had no trouble believing Apex was the victim in this story, and Arthur Vance was the man who'd betrayed it. The prosecution's theory was clean. Too clean, his attorney Rebecca Kaplan kept saying, though nobody in that room seemed interested in hearing it. Arthur had done contract security work for Apex years back, before they'd grown into what they were now. His old credentials, technically expired, had somehow authenticated a breach on the night in question. Forensic analyst Dennis Okafor had spent an entire afternoon walking the jury through a wall of server logs projected onto a screen at the front of the room, tracing a login trail that led straight back to a username nobody had touched in 3 years. The credentials were flagged inactive, Okafor testified, but never fully revoked from the back-end authentication server. On the night of the breach, they were used to access 2 restricted data partitions at 11:58 p.m. Kaplan had tried to shake him on cross. Mr. Okafor, is it possible for a third party to authenticate under someone else's stored credentials without that person's knowledge? Theoretically. Did you investigate that possibility? I investigated the evidence that was presented to me. It was a lawyer's answer, not a scientist's, and Kaplan let the silence after it do the work. It didn't land the way she needed it to. Motive, Prosecutor Julian Kane argued in his closing, was simple. Money. A man running a small operation, drowning in overhead, sitting on access nobody had bothered to revoke. Kane delivered it with the ease of someone who already knew how the story ended. Sharp suit, sharper voice. The kind of prosecutor who could make a courtroom feel like a stage built specifically for him. This isn't a mystery, Kane told the jury. This is a man who had the keys and used them. Kaplan did what she could. She poked at the timeline. She questioned the chain of custody on the forensic logs. She reminded the jury, twice, that expired credentials shouldn't authenticate anything at all without somebody actively enabling them first. It landed soft. Digital evidence sounds like fact even when it isn't, and 12 tired jurors wanted an answer more than they wanted a mystery 6 weeks deep. Presiding over all of it, from a modified position behind the elevated bench, sat Judge Eleanor Thorne. 19 years on the federal bench, the last 3 of them from a wheelchair, a detail the local papers still occasionally mentioned like it explained something about her rulings. It didn't. If anything, the chair had sharpened her. She ran her courtroom the way a surgeon runs an operating table. No wasted motion, no patience for theater. And she had a reputation for handing down sentences that rarely left much room for appeal. Attorneys who had never once set foot in her courtroom still knew her by reputation alone. Thorne doesn't blink. Court will reconvene at 9 tomorrow morning for sentencing, Thorne said, her voice flat and final, the gavel already moving toward the sound block. Arthur Vance closed his eyes. 22 years, the number the prosecution wanted. It had stopped feeling like a real number to him somewhere around week 2 of the trial, back when he still believed a jury would look at the evidence and see the holes in it the way he did. He thought about the morning they'd come for him. 4 agents at his door at 6 a.m. while Chloe was still asleep upstairs. The way they'd cuffed him in his own driveway, in full view of a neighbor walking her dog. the way that neighbor still wouldn't quite meet his eyes when they passed each other at the mailbox now. He thought about the first lawyer he'd called, a friend of a friend who'd taken one look at the case file and told him, gently, that he should start thinking seriously about a plea. He thought about the second lawyer, Rebecca Kaplan, who'd told him the opposite, and how much that had cost him to believe her, when believing her meant risking 22 years instead of 8. That's when the doors at the back of the courtroom slammed open. Every head in the gallery turned at once. Chloe Vance stood in the doorway, 17 years old, breathing hard, a manila folder crushed against her chest like it was the only solid thing left in the room. A court officer moved to intercept her before she'd taken 3 steps down the aisle. "Ma'am, you can't..." "He was at Golden Oaks!" Her voice cracked and kept going anyway. "That whole night, my dad was at a hospice in Riverdale fixing their server. I can prove it, please!" Judge Thorne's gavel came down hard enough to silence the room without a word spoken. She fixed Chloe with a look that had ended careers, the kind of stare that made grown attorneys think twice before finishing a sentence. "Young lady, this is a courtroom, not a talk show. Sit down or you will be removed." 5 minutes. Chloe's voice dropped, steadier now, aimed straight at the bench. "That's all I'm asking. My dad installs security systems. He was fixing a server at a hospice in Riverdale that whole night." She fumbled the folder open, papers sliding loose, and had to catch 2 of them before they hit the floor. "I've got the sign-in sheet. I've got photos, time-stamped, off their own maintenance app." And a text from the head nurse thanking him for staying past midnight. She'd found the sign-in log 3 nights ago, at almost 2 in the morning, going through her father's old work phone because she couldn't sleep and didn't know what else to do with her hands. The prosecution objected before she'd even finished talking. Julian Kane was on his feet, already reciting procedure, chain of custody, relevance, the whole practice litany, his voice pitched a shade too fast for a man who usually controlled every syllable that left his mouth. "Your Honor, this is wildly improper. The defense had ample opportunity to introduce alibi evidence during trial." "We didn't know it existed," Kaplan shot back, already moving toward Chloe. "Your Honor, if this is accurate, my client has been sitting in that chair for 6 weeks over a crime he was physically somewhere else for." Thorne said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the folder shaking in Chloe's hands. She looked at Arthur Vance, who had turned fully around in his seat, and who was no longer looking at the folder at all. He was looking at his daughter. "Your Honor," Arthur's voice broke on the second word, and for the first time in 6 weeks of trial, it wasn't careful, wasn't calculated, just a father's voice, raw and stripped down to nothing. "I have never asked this court for anything. I'm asking now. Please look at what she brought you before you send me away from her." Somewhere behind him, a reporter had already stopped typing to watch. Eleanor Thorne had presided over more trials than she could accurately count, and she had learned a long time ago not to let desperation move her. Desperation was the default setting of nearly every defendant she'd ever sentenced. It rarely meant innocence. It usually just meant fear. But something about the stillness in that folder, the way Chloe hadn't flinched, the way Arthur hadn't performed a single second of that plea, got past a wall she generally kept locked down tight. She held up a hand before Kane could object again. "Bring it forward." The bailiff carried the folder to the bench. Thorne opened it slowly, scanning the sign-in sheet from Golden Oaks Hospice, the maintenance app timestamps, grainy security camera stills showing a man in a gray work jacket kneeling in front of a server rack at 11:40 at night. Precisely inside the window the prosecution claimed he'd been breaching Apex Dynamics 40 minutes uptown. 2 locations, 1 man. It wasn't possible to be in both places at once, and no login trail in the world changed that fact. "Your Honor, this material is unauthenticated," Kane said. "It could have been fabricated in the last 24 hours specifically for this purpose." "It could have," Thorne agreed, not looking up. "Which is exactly the kind of question this court is capable of answering, Mr. Kane, if it's given the chance to look." She set the folder down. The courtroom waited. Somewhere in the back row, a clerk who'd worked under Thorne for 6 years leaned toward a colleague and whispered that she'd never once seen the judge reopen a case this late. "Sentencing is postponed," Thorne said. "This court is reopening the evidentiary phase, effective immediately. I want the head nurse of Golden Oaks Hospice served with a subpoena by end of day tomorrow." Her eyes moved to Kane, cool and unreadable. "And Mr. Kane, I want to be very clear about something. If this alibi holds up under oath, I am going to want to know how a man capable of confusing the wrong login credential with the right one became your entire case." Kane's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough for someone watching closely to notice. Eleanor Thorne had spent 19 years learning to notice exactly that. She'd been on this bench since before half the attorneys in her courtroom had passed the bar, and in all that time she'd developed a private rule she never said out loud. The innocent rarely bring you paperwork. They bring you protest, disbelief, sometimes tears, but rarely a folder with photographs already organized in chronological order. A folder like that took planning. It took someone who'd sat with the evidence long enough to understand exactly what it proved. That was the detail that stayed with her walking back to chambers that afternoon, more than the photographs themselves. 3 days later, the courtroom filled again, though the energy in the room had shifted. Reporters who'd shown up expecting a formality now sat forward in their seats, notebooks open, phones angled toward outlets they wouldn't need for hours. Word had already leaked, the way it always does, that something in the Vance case had cracked open, and the gallery was packed tighter than it had been for any single day of the original 6-week trial. Thorne moved through the preliminary motions with the same clipped efficiency she always used, cutting off Kane's renewed objections before he finished forming them. "Mr. Kane, I've already ruled on the admissibility question. You're welcome to appeal my decision through the appropriate channels after this hearing concludes. Until then, we proceed." Kane sat back down, a muscle working in his jaw. Across the aisle, Arthur watched him with the wary attention of a man who'd learned, the hard way, exactly how much could hide behind a well-tailored suit. Rebecca Kaplan rose. "The defense calls Clara Rossi." A woman in her 50s walked to the stand, hospital scrubs swapped for a simple gray cardigan, her hands folded tight in front of her the way people hold themselves when they're trying not to shake. She'd worked as head nurse at Golden Oaks for 11 years. Sworn in, seated. Kaplan approached with the kind of careful patience reserved for a witness who mattered more than she'd been told. "Mrs. Rossi, can you tell the court whether you know the defendant, Arthur Vance?" "Yes, he installed our new security and monitoring system a few months back, and he came in that particular night to fix a server issue that had knocked out our nurse call system. That's not a small thing in a hospice. We can't have that system down for even an hour, let alone all night. And can you tell the court what time he arrived and what time he left?" Clara Rossi's eyes flicked, just once, toward the prosecution table. "He got there around 9 that evening. He didn't leave until almost 2 in the morning. I know because I signed him in myself, and I brought him a cup of coffee around midnight because he looked dead on his feet. We talked for a minute while he worked. He showed me a photo of his daughter on his phone, told me she was starting her senior year soon." Kaplan produced a printed copy of the facility's sign-in log, entered it as an exhibit, and let Clara Rossi confirm her own signature beside Arthur's, time-stamped in ink that couldn't be argued with the way a digital file sometimes could. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that has actual weight to it, and Kaplan let it sit for a second before she kept going. Julian Kane sat very still at the prosecution table, one hand flat on a legal pad he hadn't written on in 10 minutes. He'd built his closing argument around a login trail and a motive built out of overdue bills, and now a woman in a gray cardigan had just placed his defendant 40 minutes uptown from the crime scene, in ink, with her own signature next to his. His junior associate leaned over and whispered something. Kane didn't answer her. He was watching Judge Thorne's face, the way a man watches weather rolling in from somewhere he can't outrun. "Mrs. Rossi," Kaplan said, "is there anything else about the days leading up to your testimony today that you think this court should know?" Clara Rossi hesitated. Her hands tightened in her lap. "Two police officers came to my facility the day before yesterday," she said. "They weren't in uniform." It had been almost 6 in the evening, near the end of her shift, when they'd shown up at the nurse's station asking for her by name. One flashed a badge too fast for me to read it properly. They asked a lot of questions that weren't really questions, more like suggestions. One of them had leaned against the counter like he had all the time in the world, and the other had done most of the talking. They said testifying in a case like this could get complicated for a small facility that depends on city contracts and inspections. Her voice wavered, then firmed back up. "I told them I don't lie under oath. Not for anybody, badge or no badge." "Did they identify themselves?" Kaplan asked again. "Not really. When I asked for a card, one of them said he was out of them. I've worked in hospitals long enough to know what a real follow-up looks like. That wasn't it." She described it slowly, like she was still working out the shape of it herself. They'd waited until the shift change, until the lobby had mostly cleared out, and the taller one had done the talking, while the other one just stood there, watching the hallway behind her like he was counting exits. He said, "We just want to make sure your recollection holds up." And I remember thinking, that's a strange thing to say to somebody about a night I already remember perfectly. It wasn't a question. It was a warning, dressed up as one. Kane rose fast. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay, and frankly, it's an attempt to inflame—" "Overruled." Thorne's voice cut clean through his. "I'd very much like to hear the rest of it, Mr. Kane, and so, I suspect, would this jury." The gallery had gone electric. That particular hum of a room realizing it's watching something it wasn't supposed to see. Arthur Vance sat with both hands flat on the defense table, staring at Clara Rossi like a man watching a door open onto a hallway he hadn't known existed. Eleanor Thorne watched too, but she wasn't just listening to the nurse anymore. She was watching Julian Kane's face, cataloging every twitch of it, the way she'd learned to read a courtroom the way other people read weather. Kane attempted a cross-examination, brief and clumsy in a way that didn't match 6 weeks of otherwise flawless performance. "Mrs. Rossi, isn't it possible you're simply mistaken about the exact timing of that evening?" "I've worked 12-hour night shifts in that building for 11 years, Clara Rossi said, steady now, all the tremor gone from her voice. "I don't get the timing of a nurse call system failure wrong. Lives depend on that system. I remember every hour it was down, and I remember every hour Arthur Vance spent fixing it." Kane had no follow-up. He sat back down slowly, and something in his posture had already changed, like a man realizing the ground under him had shifted before he'd noticed it move. Something about this case had roots that ran a lot deeper than one confused security log. And for the first time since the trial started, half the reporters in that gallery had stopped writing about Arthur Vance entirely. The recess that followed was short, but it was long enough for Eleanor Thorne to make a decision she rarely made twice in the same trial. She called both attorneys into chambers. The door clicked shut behind them, and for a second, nobody said anything at all. "Mr. Kane," she said finally, "your entire case rested on a digital fingerprint that just got contradicted by a hospice server log, a maintenance app, and a nurse who apparently got a visit from officers who wouldn't show her a badge. Walk me through how that happens without somebody upstream deciding this case needed a fast, tidy ending." "Your Honor, I run my cases the way they're presented to me by the investigating agency. I'm not responsible for—" "You tried to keep that folder out of my courtroom," Thorne said, quiet now, which was worse than loud. "Twice. And you tried to keep Mrs. Rossi off that stand before she'd said a single word. That's not a prosecutor protecting a clean case, Mr. Kane. That's a man protecting something else." Kane's composure, the same composure that had carried him through 6 weeks of trial without a crack in it, slipped for just a second. "With respect, Your Honor, you're speculating. I'm a federal judge with 19 years on this bench, Thorne said. Speculating is the first half of my job. The second half is finding out I was right. She wheeled herself half a foot closer to his side of the table. I've watched a lot of prosecutors in my time, Mr. Kane. Most of them fight like they believe in the case. You've spent 6 weeks fighting like a man trying to reach the finish line before somebody stops to ask a question he can't answer. I want full disclosure on the origin of the forensic evidence against Arthur Vance. Every hand that touched it. Every agency that signed off on it. You have until Monday. Kane didn't answer right away, and in the silence, Eleanor Thorne understood something she hadn't wanted to admit to herself since the trial began. This wasn't about one man's server credentials anymore. It never had been. Rebecca Kaplan said nothing on the way out, but she caught Kane's reflection in the glass of the chamber's door as they left, and for just a moment he looked less like a man who'd been caught and more like a man who'd been waiting to be caught for a very long time. While the court adjourned for the weekend, Arthur Vance and Rebecca Kaplan sat in her cramped downtown office, surrounded by boxes of discovery material nobody had bothered to read closely the first time around, because nobody had needed to. The case had been supposed to be simple. It wasn't. Kaplan had brought in a forensic accountant, a wiry, exhausted man named Teddy Nakamura, who'd spent 2 straight days tracing Apex Dynamics financial filings back through a maze of shell entities registered in 3 different states. He arrived at the office with a duffel bag full of printouts and the hollow-eyed look of a man who hadn't slept properly since Thorne reopened the case, and he spread the printouts across the table like a man laying out a crime scene. "So what is this, actually?" Arthur asked. "On paper. Cloud storage, analytics, enterprise security contracts, that's the front door." Nakamura tapped a column of figures running through a subsidiary with a name that meant nothing to anybody. "But look at these transfers. $40 million moved through a shell called Meridian Vector Holdings over the last 2 years alone. No product, no employees on record, just money going in from Apex and money going out to accounts I couldn't fully trace, though I got close enough on 2 of them to recognize the pattern." "What pattern?" Kaplan asked. "Data laundering." Nakamura let that sit a second. "Same principle as moving dirty cash through a legitimate business, except what's getting cleaned isn't money, it's information. Corporate secrets, government contractor files, personal data pulled off compromised networks, all of it gets funneled through Apex's systems, repackaged, and sold off to buyers who'd rather not show up on anybody's radar. It's a quiet business. It doesn't need headlines. It just needs nobody looking too closely. Ever. At any single piece of it." Kaplan sat back slow. "So the breach that hit Apex that night wasn't a theft," Nakamura said. "I think it was an internal transfer that somebody needed a fall guy for." Arthur's hands, steady through 6 weeks of trial, were shaking now. They needed somebody with old, forgotten credentials. Somebody who wouldn't have the resources to fight it. Somebody who'd take a plea just to protect his daughter from the cost of a trial. "How far up does this go?" Kaplan asked. Nakamura shook his head slowly. "That's the part I can't answer yet. Whoever set up Meridian Vector knew exactly how to keep the paper trail thin. 3 layers of shell entities, 2 of them registered by the same law firm in Delaware, and a board of directors that's really just one guy who signs paperwork for 11 different companies that all happen to share an accountant." He tapped a name circled twice in red ink. "This name here shows up on a wire transfer memo 4 times. It's not a company. It's a person, and I don't recognize it yet, but somebody in that building will." "And when you didn't take the plea," Kaplan said quietly, "they needed a prosecutor willing to make sure the case never looked past you." Arthur sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling of an office that suddenly felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. 6 weeks of his life, his business, his daughter, watching him sit at that defense table every single day. All of it built on a scheme he'd never had anything to do with, run by people who'd never had to learn his name to decide his life was worth spending. Nobody in that office said Julian Kane's name out loud. Chloe sat quietly in the corner with her knees pulled up to her chest, listening to grown adults describe, in careful professional language, exactly how close her father had come to losing the rest of his life to a company he'd worked for briefly a decade ago and barely remembered. Julian Kane missed his Monday deadline. He missed the Tuesday hearing entirely. Thorne noted his absence for the record in a tone that made every reporter in the gallery sit up a little straighter, and ordered his office to produce him or an explanation by end of day. By Wednesday, his office released a brief statement citing a family emergency, though nobody who worked with him could name a single family member he'd ever mentioned in 3 years on the job. His deputy, a junior attorney barely 2 years out of law school, looked visibly rattled fielding questions on the courthouse steps, insisting she had no information beyond what the statement said, her voice climbing half an octave every time a reporter pushed back. Thorne rescheduled the disclosure hearing without comment, her expression giving away exactly nothing to the reporters camped outside her chambers. 2 days later, his car was found abandoned near a stretch of the East River access road, driver's door open, engine cold, his phone still sitting in the cup holder with the screen cracked. His body was recovered that same afternoon. The department's initial report used one clean clinical phrase: self-inflicted. No signs of struggle. Nobody who had watched Julian Kane fold under Thorne's questioning 3 days earlier believed a word of it. A detective assigned to the case gave a brief statement to reporters camped outside the precinct, saying only that the investigation remained open pending toxicology results, and declining to answer when asked whether the missing laptop had been located. Legal commentators on every cable channel spent that evening picking apart the timing. A federal prosecutor found dead 2 days before he was due to hand a judge a full accounting of his own case, and none of them had a clean explanation for it either. There was no note, no explanation. His laptop, the one everyone assumed held the disclosure files Thorne had ordered, was gone from his office entirely, checked out of evidence storage the night before, under a signature nobody could verify against any name on staff. The New York Times ran the story above the fold the next morning, careful with its language, heavy with implication. A city already primed by weeks of courtroom drama didn't need much encouragement to read between the lines. Arthur Vance sat in Kaplan's office that night, staring at a printed copy of the article. They killed him. Not a question. "We don't know that," Kaplan said, though her voice didn't carry much conviction behind it. "He was scared in that meeting, Rebecca. Scared, not guilty. There's a difference. And I've had 6 weeks to learn what both of those look like on a man's face." Arthur set the paper down. Somebody wanted his files gone before Monday, and now they are. Chloe, curled into the office's one worn armchair, hadn't said much all evening. She was 17, and she'd already learned more about how the world actually worked than most adults twice her age wanted to admit existed. She reached for her backpack, unzipped the front pocket out of habit more than purpose, and stopped. There was a small padded envelope in there that wasn't hers. "This isn't mine." Chloe turned the envelope over in her hands. The label read, "Rebecca Kaplan, attorney at law," postmarked 4 days earlier, the same week Kane had missed his deadline. "It came to your office. The paralegal must have handed it to me by mistake when I was picking up the Golden Oaks files this morning. I completely forgot I had it." Kaplan took it carefully, like it might still be capable of hurting somebody, and opened it at the desk. Inside, wrapped in a single sheet of blank paper, sat a plain black flash drive. No note, no explanation, just Kane's name in the return address corner, written in handwriting that matched the signature on 6 weeks of court filings. Nakamura plugged it into a laptop that had never touched the firm's main network, the kind of precaution he'd learned to take the hard way, in cases exactly like this one. The drive held a single folder of audio files, time-stamped over the course of nearly a year, recorded on what looked like a personal device rather than any official wiretap. The first file was dated months before Arthur's arrest. A voice, smooth, confident, unmistakably a man used to being obeyed, filled the room. "It's handled. Vance doesn't have the money for a real defense, and Kane's already agreed to keep it simple. We just need this closed before the Meridian audit gets anywhere near a subpoena." A second voice answered, older, gravelly, carrying the practiced cadence of a man who'd spent decades speaking for a microphone. "Just make sure it stays contained to the courtroom. I can manage oversight on my end as long as this doesn't become a headline before the appropriations vote." Kaplan paused the recording. Nobody in the room breathed for a second. "That first voice," Nakamura said slowly, "that's Victor Kessler, CEO of Apex Dynamics. I've heard him on 3 different investor calls." "And the second one," Arthur said. Kaplan was already scrolling through the metadata, cross-referencing a name Kane had apparently flagged in the file's title. "Senator Robert Holloway," she said, "chairs the subcommittee that oversees federal data infrastructure contracts." Nakamura clicked to a later file, dated less than 2 weeks before Kane's disappearance. This one was shorter, rougher, recorded from farther away, like it had been captured through a phone left running in a jacket pocket rather than set up deliberately. "You're getting cold feet at exactly the wrong time, Julian." Kessler's voice again, quieter this time, harder. "You built this case, you close it. Or somebody else closes it for you, and you won't like how that version ends." There was a long pause on the recording. Then Kane's own voice, unmistakable, the same voice that had spent 6 weeks commanding that courtroom, sounding smaller than anyone in the room had ever heard it. "I've done what you asked. I'm not doing anything else." The file ended there. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Nakamura clicked to one more file, the last one in the folder, dated only 3 days before Kane disappeared. This one was cleaner, closer, like Kane had finally stopped being careful about hiding the recorder. His own voice opened it. "This is Julian Kane, for the record, in case anyone ever has to make sense of this. Everything on this drive was recorded without the knowledge of the individuals involved, over the course of 11 months, because I could not find another way to prove what I already knew." A pause, then his voice again, quieter. "I made a mistake taking this case the way I took it. I'm trying to fix that now, before I run out of time to." The file ended there, and this time, nobody in the room said anything at all. Kaplan looked up at Arthur, and for the first time in 6 weeks, something steadier than fear had crept into her voice. "Arthur, Julian Kane wasn't protecting them, not by the end. He was building a case against them, and he mailed it to us before whoever silenced him got the chance to stop it." The courtroom had never been this full. Federal marshals lined the walls instead of the usual single bailiff. Reporters spilled into the overflow room down the hall, and outside on the courthouse steps, camera crews had set up before sunrise, tipped off by a leak nobody bothered denying anymore. Eleanor Thorne entered through the side chamber door, wheeled herself up to the bench with the same clipped efficiency she'd used every day of this trial, and looked out over a room that finally understood exactly how large this case had become. "This court has received evidence," Thorne said, "that materially changes the nature of these proceedings. I have exercised my authority to compel the appearance of 2 additional individuals whose conduct has become directly relevant to this case." The side doors opened. Victor Kessler walked in, flanked by 2 attorneys who looked like they hadn't slept in 3 days, his tailored suit doing nothing to soften the tight set of his jaw. Behind him came Senator Robert Holloway, a man built for cameras and podiums, visibly unused to being summoned rather than announced. Kaplan rose. "Your Honor, the defense would like to enter into evidence a series of recordings recovered from materials sent by the late Assistant United States Attorney Julian Kane prior to his death." Kessler's attorney was on his feet instantly. "Your Honor, we have not had adequate time to review." "You'll have your chance to respond," Thorne said without looking at him. "Right now, this courtroom is going to listen." The first recording played through the courtroom speakers, Kessler's voice filling the silence exactly the way it had filled Kaplan's office 3 nights earlier. Then the second file. Then the third, the rough one, Kessler's threat and Kane's small, breaking refusal, laid bare in front of a gallery that had gone so quiet the hum of the courthouse air system was the loudest sound in the room. Then a fourth file, this one capturing a conversation about the police visit to Clara Rossi, ordered, in Kessler's own words, to make sure the nurse understood the stakes of her testimony. Holloway's face had gone the color of old paper. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering something urgent, and got nothing back but a slow, grim shake of the head. When Thorne asked if he wished to address the court, Holloway rose slowly, buttoning his jacket out of habit before he seemed to remember there was nothing left to button it for.
Your Honor, I'd like the record to reflect that I was never informed of the specifics regarding Mr. Vance's prosecution. His voice, so practiced on Senate floor cameras, sounded thin in the room. Senator, Thorne said, the record already reflects your voice, on tape, discussing the appropriations vote in the same breath as this case. I'd suggest saving the rest for your own attorney. Holloway sat back down without another word. Kessler's attorney kept objecting. Thorne kept overruling him, calm, unhurried, letting every word land exactly the way it was meant to. Your Honor, my client's voice on a recording proves nothing about intent. Counselor, Thorne said, your client's voice on tape discussing the framing of an innocent man and the intimidation of a material witness is not a legal ambiguity. It's a confession that happened to be recorded by the man you tried to silence before he could hand it to somebody who'd listen. By the time the recording's finished, the courtroom didn't need a verdict read out loud to understand what had just happened. The silence afterward wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Thorne looked directly at Kessler for the first time since he'd walked in. Mr. Kessler, you built a company that presented itself to the public as infrastructure and security. You used that trust as cover to launder stolen data, and when a working man's forgotten login credentials gave you a convenient place to point a federal investigation, you took it, without a moment's hesitation about what it would cost him or his daughter. That is not a business decision. That is a choice you are going to answer for. Kessler said nothing. There was, finally, nothing left for him to say. Federal marshals moved first toward Kessler, then toward Holloway, the senator's protest dying somewhere between his mouth and the reality of two agents reading him his rights in front of a room full of cameras. Kessler didn't bother protesting at all. He simply stood there, jaw tight, watching 6 years of careful construction collapse in under 20 minutes. Somewhere in the gallery, a reporter was already typing so fast her laptop keys sounded like rain. Arthur Vance sat frozen at the defense table, one hand gripping the edge like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Chloe was already crying, not from fear this time, but from something that finally had room to be relief. Rebecca Kaplan reached over and put a hand on Arthur's shoulder, and he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the night his daughter walked into that courtroom. Arthur reached back and found Chloe's hand across the low rail separating the gallery from the defense table, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because there wasn't a sentence built yet that covered 6 weeks of this. "I never doubted you," Chloe said finally, her voice thick. "I know," Arthur said. "I doubted me, some nights. I'm sorry for that." "Don't be," she said. "You're the one who taught me to read the whole file before I believed anything in it. I just did what you taught me." Eleanor Thorne watched the marshals lead both men out, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. She thought about the 3 years since the attack that put her in this chair. 3 years of telling herself the system worked slow, but it worked. 3 years of quietly wondering whether that was still true, or whether she'd simply stopped expecting better because expecting better hurt too much. She looked at Chloe Vance, 17 years old, who had walked through those courtroom doors with nothing but a folder and the unshakable belief that the truth still mattered somewhere in a building full of people paid to weigh it. Eleanor Thorne gripped both armrests of her wheelchair, planted her hands flat against the bench, and pushed herself upright. Her legs trembled under her, unused to bearing weight, and for one long, silent second, the entire courtroom watched a woman refuse to stay seated for what she was about to say. "This court finds the defendant, Arthur Vance, not guilty on all counts," she said, her voice carrying clean across a room gone utterly still. "And this court further orders a full federal investigation into Apex Dynamics, Meridian Vector Holdings, and every individual named in the evidence submitted today.
She held that standing position a moment longer than she needed to, not for the room, but for herself. Then she sat back down, steady, and reached for her gavel. Arthur Vance walked out of that courthouse a free man 3 weeks later, once the paperwork finally caught up to what everybody already knew. Apex Dynamics collapsed under the weight of a federal investigation that eventually tied Meridian Vector Holdings to data pipelines feeding 3 separate underground buyers across 2 continents. Victor Kessler took a plea that kept him out of open court and put him away for a very long time regardless. Senator Robert Halloway resigned before the Ethics Committee could finish its first hearing. His subcommittee dissolved within the month, his name quietly scrubbed from the letterhead of a dozen boards that had once been proud to have it there. Arthur's small business survived, barely, on the strength of clients who'd followed the case closely enough to know exactly what kind of man they'd almost lost. He hired a 3rd employee that fall, business cards printed with a new tagline underneath his name. Something Chloe had suggested half as a joke that ended up sticking anyway. Systems you can trust. Installed by a man who kept his. Dennis Okafor, the forensic analyst whose testimony had once nearly sent Arthur away for 22 years, testified again 8 months later, this time for the federal investigation into Apex Dynamics, walking a grand jury through the exact same authentication logs and explaining, this time, exactly how easily they could be altered by someone with back-end access and a reason to point the trail somewhere convenient. He never spoke to Arthur directly, but he sent a short note through Kaplan's office afterward. It said only that he was sorry it had taken him this long to ask the right question. Clara Rossi went back to Golden Oaks Hospice and the nurse call system Arthur had installed, the one that had accidentally saved his life by breaking down on exactly the wrong night for anybody trying to frame him. She still keeps his business card taped inside her desk drawer, just in case. Rebecca Kaplan kept a printed still frame from the hospice security footage on her office wall, the one showing a man kneeling in front of a server rack at 11:40 at night, the small, quiet image that had cracked open a conspiracy reaching all the way to the United States Senate. Clients ask about it sometimes. She tells them the short version. It's usually enough. Chloe Vance started her senior year of high school 3 weeks after her father walked free, and when her guidance counselor asked what she wanted to study, she didn't hesitate the way most 17-year-olds do, standing at the edge of that particular question. Pre-law, she said. She wanted to be the kind of attorney who read the folder all the way through before deciding what it meant. And Eleanor Thorne, back behind her bench, back in her chair, told a reporter who asked about that moment exactly one thing before her clerk ushered him out of chambers. "I didn't stand up because my legs suddenly remembered how," she said. "I stood up because a 17-year-old girl reminded me why I sat down behind that bench in the first place. The rest was just muscle catching up to the point."
If you were trapped by the system, would you trust your family to save you? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe.